on March 21, 1935. A clerk in Tehran fed a single sheet of paper into a typewriter and effectively made a nation vanish. Outside the office, flags snapped in the cold wind and boots hit the stone in a rhythmic march. But the real revolution was happening on paper. Most people believe Persia became Iran because a king wanted to reclaim his pride. But the romantic version of history is a lie. It didn't change because of culture. It changed because of the ledger, the balance sheet, and the paralyzing fear of insolvency. The world prefers a clean story, something polished like a museum label under glass. The word Persia evokes gold bowls, ancient poetry, and the scent of slow-burning incense. In contrast, Iran sounds like hard borders, telegraph cables, and the cold reality of the news. But countries are not poems. They are accounts payable. When bankruptcy begins to whisper, even the most ancient and majestic names start looking like liabilities that must be liquidated. At its peak, the old majesty was a machine where tribute moved like a river. In the ruins of Persepolis, you can still feel the heat and sweat of a parade that never ended. Every satrapy was a line item. Every caravan was a rolling tax receipt. The empire was never just land, it was revenue wearing a crown. Foreigners called the entire region Persia simply because they met one province first and assumed the rest. It was branding before advertising existed, a shortcut for distant tongues that eventually became a premium label stamped on carpets, silk, and myths. Yet, beneath this gilded surface, the foundation was already rotting. Empires rarely die from a single sword thrust. They die from payroll gaps, broken supply lines, and taxes that arrive too late to matter. In every century, this same quiet killer returns. The army grows, the roads crack, the treasury thins, and eventually the map begins to lie about its own strength. Even in the age of Cyrus, the true miracle was not conquest, it was administration. The royal road was not built for romance, it was built for logistica, literal bloodstream of a fiscal state. A message system is ultimately a collection system. If you can deliver orders fast, you can collect taxes faster. The clay cylinder of Cyrus is often treated as a moral manifesto, but it was actually power preserved as text. It was the ancient version of a press release, a legal promise designed to calm markets and stabilize credit. Legitimacy is credit, and credit is oxygen. A ruler who appears stable can borrow loyalty at a much cheaper rate. However, a vast empire carries a vast overhead that never sleeps. Garrison wages, grain reserves, and bribes for local elites do not care about a king's ancestry. The ledger does not bow to royalty. Eventually, every dynasty falls into the same trap. The addiction to easy revenue. When wealth flows without effort, rulers stop building resilient systems and start spending tomorrow's money today. In ancient Persia, the addiction was tribute that depended entirely on distance and obedience. When provinces resist, revenue drops, while military costs explode. When trade routes shift, customs vanish overnight. Alexander the Great did not just bring spears to the gates. He brought a hostile audit. He severed the systems that moved wealth, freezing the empire's credit until the allies turned away. After empire's fracture, the accountants simply change uniforms and keep counting the same land. Whether it was the Seleucid Sparthians or Sasanians, each successor tried to restart the same frozen cash flow. They inherited the palaces, but they also inherited the obligations and the repair bills. History constantly changes its mask, yet the ledger keeps the same cold, calculating eyes. The transition from Persia to Iran was the final attempt to settle an ancient debt. Then Islam arrives, and outsiders tell you it erased Persia. That's a lazy story told by people who never read receipts. Culture survives because it is useful. and usefulness is economic. Bureaucracy, language, and craft remain because they keep commerce alive. Identity doesn't die. It gets refinanced. Centuries roll forward, and the land becomes a corridor of invasions. Turks, Mongols, and warlords treat cities like cash machines. Each conquest is an extraction event. Each victory is also a liquidation sale. The population pays in bread, daughters, and silver. By the time the Safavids rise, the problem is no longer survival alone. It is differentiation in a violent market of empires. They need a unifying banner that can discipline taxes and armies. So faith becomes policy, and policy becomes payroll. They build a state that can invoice its own territory. Here's the twist. Most documentaries whisper past. Inside the country, many people already used Iran in their own language. It was a domestic name, like a family nickname. Persia was the export label, the name printed for foreign buyers. One name for home, one name for the market. That split is not poetic, it is financial strategy. When you sell goods abroad, your brand becomes collateral. Foreigners associate Persia with exotic luxury and ancient inevitability. That sounds flattering until you need modern credit. Lenders don't finance myths, they finance predictable states. Now enter the modern age, where rifles meet railroads and the bill comes due. By the late 1800s, the Qajar court is drowning in concessions and loans. Customs revenue gets pledged like a pawned ring. A state that can't tax efficiently becomes dependent on outsiders who can. Debt becomes a living monster. Picture that monster as a quiet man in London with ink-stained fingers. He doesn't need an army. He has contracts, interest, and deadlines. He waits for payment the way winter waits for leaves to fall. The antagonist is not a general. It is the creditor class. In this era, cash is power, and cash is scarce. The core prints promises, sells monopolies, and mortgages its future. A tobacco deal here, a railway scheme there, each one sold as development. But development financed by desperation is just bondage with better stationery. The ledger starts to bleed. Then oil appears, and it changes the math like a loaded revolver. Suddenly the land is not only ancient, it is profitable. Foreign companies smell it first because they have the rigs and the ships. The state, short on cash, signs away chunks of sovereignty for advances. It's a trade. Today's wages for tomorrow's wealth. By 1908, the oil story hardens into infrastructure, and infrastructure hardens into dependency. Pipelines become veins you don't fully control. Refineries become cities with fences around them. The workers breathe fumes while shareholders breathe dividends. The resource curse is not a theory. It is a schedule. Abadan refinery-related image. In 1925, Reza Khan rises and becomes Reza Shah, and he wants a new kind of state. He wants uniforms, schools, roads, and a rail line that stitches the plateau together. That dream costs money, and money has to come from somewhere. Taxes are weak, agriculture is fragile, and oil money is constrained. So he squeezes, borrows, and centralizes. The Great Depression hits like a fist in the mouth. Commodity prices sag, trade slows, and the state's income gasps. Imagine the 1931 budget with ink smears and crossed-out numbers. Revenue targets missed by millions of rials. Debt service remains because interest does not care about your drought. Let that number sink in, even if it's just one line in a forgotten file. In a single fiscal year, suppose projected revenue was 1.2 billion rials, but only 780 million arrived. The gap is not abstract. It is unpaid soldiers and stalled trains. That is how states collapse without a battle. This is the economic trap, and it tightens with every modernization project. Railways require steel and imported parts, paid in hard currency. Hard currency comes from exports, and exports are hostage to global prices. When the market turns, your national pride meets a cashier's window. Pride gets declined. So Reza Shah looks for leverage that doesn't require cash. He can't print foreign exchange. He can't charm bondholders into mercy, but he can change the story the world tells about his country. He can rebrand the asset called national identity to influence the terms of recognition. Here is the noir detail nobody lingers on. Names are not just culture. Names are credit signals. A modern name can suggest a modern state. A state that looks modern may negotiate better contracts. In a world of paperwork, perception is a currency. That brings us back to the 21st of March, 1935, and that hard little sheet of paper. A diplomatic circular goes out, asking embassies to use Iran officially. It reads polite, but it lands like a demand. Think of it as a corporate memo announcing a merger. The old brand is being retired. This is the smoking gun moment, and it is quieter than gunfire. No cavalry charge, no palace burning, no grand referendum, just ink, seals, and a mailing list of foreign ministries. A nation performs a liquidation sale of its own global image. Reza Shah's reference image behind that memo is a brutal negotiation with the invisible market. Persia is beautiful, but it is also a colonial exhibit label. It invites outsiders to treat the country as a theme, not a counterpart. Iran sounds like a state with borders, bureaucracy, and seriousness. That seriousness is aimed at creditors. Imagine the dialogue in a closed room, paraphrased in the language of survival. Call us by our internal name and treat us like a sovereign ledger. Stop buying our past and start respecting our contracts. We are not your storybook. We are your supplier and your debtor. It is diplomacy spoken through accounting, but a rebrand cannot fix a broken cash engine. If oil royalties are thin, schools still need funding. If imports cost sterling, the real still sweats. If that sits at, you say, £25 million in external obligations, the interest still ticks daily. A new name doesn't erase the invoice. Then the rule of three returns, like footsteps in an alley. The oil income was limited. The customs revenue was pressured. The foreign influence was constant. Each problem alone is manageable, but together they create insolvency. This is where the story sharpens into thriller territory. In 1941, war turns Iran into a strategic corridor, and sovereignty gets bargained away in practice. When great powers move troops, they also move priorities. The state becomes a hallway, not a house, and hallways don't set the rules. By the early 1950s, oil becomes the central artery of the national budget. Let's put numbers on the addiction, because numbers are the language of the trap. If the Treasury expects $200 million a year from oil-linked income, losing it is cardiac arrest. When that flow stops, everything else panics. In 1951, the oil nationalization crisis turns the ledger into a battlefield. Suddenly, shipments falter, contracts freeze, and revenue collapses. It's economic warfare, fought with embargoes and insurance blocks. No bullets needed when you can lock a nation out of its own cash register. Think about the scale of that squeeze. A refinery can stand there, massive and humming, yet produce nothing you can sell. Workers still need pay, but sales vanish. The state still owes salaries, but hard currency dries up. This is how a country can be rich and broke at the same time. Here, the antagonist shows its real face. Not a single villain, but a network. Bondholders, oil markets, foreign ministries, and corporate boards. They act like gravity, not like armies. They don't hate you. They just enforce terms. And terms are merciless. This is the descent, and it spirals in dates and figures. Suppose in mid-1951, oil revenue drops by 70% within 6 months. Suppose foreign reserves fall from $140 million to $35 million by early 1952. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The Allies had turned away. When reserves thin, the currency starts coughing. Imports shrink, prices rise, and bread becomes political. Black markets bloom like mold. People don't debate ideology when fuel is scarce. They debate dinner. This is where sovereignty is. Solvency stops being a slogan and becomes physics. A state that can't pay, can't choose, it can't control its ports, because it can't insure its ships. It can't control its wages, because it can't stabilize its currency. Freedom dies in small receipts. Now rewind, because the title question is about the name change, and this is the connective tissue. The switch from Persia to Iran wasn't the ending. It was the opening move in a longer fight over who writes the balance sheet. It was a signet flare saying, "We exist as a modern claimant," yet the world kept two names in its mouth, like a split tongue. Persia remained a nostalgic luxury brand, safe and ape. Iran became the name used for diplomacy, conflict, and headlines. One name sells rugs, the other sells fear. That difference is a market outcome. In 1979, revolution detonates the political order, and the global credit relationship fractures again. New rulers inherit old constraints, plus new sanctions. Money gets tighter, not looser. The economy becomes a sealed room with shrinking oxygen. Every decision is made under financial pressure. If you want a single line that explains the last century, it's this: a state can survive invasion and survive coups, but struggle to survive cash isolation. You can fight soldiers. You can't punch an interest rate. You can't arrest an embargo. So what did the 1935 memo really do? It tried to replace a romantic export label with a sovereign legal identity. It tried to move the country from artifact to actor. It was brand management aimed at power. And in the modern world, brand management is financial warfare. Let's treat the name Persia like an asset on a balance sheet. It has prestige value, tourism value, cultural value, and soft power. But it also carries colonial baggage like a hidden liability. It invites meddling disguised as scholarship. It makes outsiders feel entitled to define you. Now, treat Iran like a different asset class. It is closer to the internal self-description, and it sounds administratively real. It aims to imply nationhood, not just heritage. It is a bid for better terms in global paperwork. It's a line item labeled control. The tragedy is that neither name can fully protect you from resource addiction. When a budget depends on one export, you become a hostage to price charts. If oil falls from $3 a barrel equivalent to a lower real value, your plans bleed. If it rises, you overpromise, then crash later. That boom-bust rhythm scars generations because it trains governments to chase quick fixes. Print money, cut subsidies, arrest traders, blame enemies. The symptoms change, but the illness remains. A narrow revenue base turns politics into panic management. Panic makes bad contracts. Now we reach the climax. The default, the moment the money literally runs out. It can be a week when reserves hit a floor and the central bank can't defend the rate. It can be a month when civil servants miss 2 paychecks. It can be a winter when heating fuel is rationed. humiliation arrives quietly. Hunger is not cinematic, but it is decisive. When bread prices jump, people lose patience with symbols. When hospitals lack imports, ideology becomes secondary. When fathers can't work, the state's legitimacy cracks. Sovereignty is solvency, and solvency is daily life. So what's the final twist? The one that title promises. Persia didn't become Iran like a costume change. Persia was a foreign-facing brand, and Iran was the internal name stepping into international law. The switch was a strategic response to financial pressure and image-based leverage. It was the ledger's logic wearing cultural clothes, and the aftermath is long, because debts live longer than kings. Suppose a package of external obligations, refinanced and reshaped, took until 1968 to fully close. Imagine the final check, stamped and filed, ending one chain of terms. Even then, the habit of dependency remains in the bloodstream. Generational scars don't show on monuments, but they show in policy. Centralization intensifies because decentralized tax systems feel risky. Security budgets rise because instability threatens revenue. Leaders learn to fear the market more than the mob, and the people inherit the bill in slow motion. Today, you can still hear both names like competing narrators. Persia is invoked to sell a lost elegance, often to audiences who prefer history without consequences. Iran is invoked to frame a living state, often to audiences who prefer consequences without history. The split is profitable for outsiders. Confusion is a commodity. If you ever wondered why a simple name carries so much voltage, now you know. It is not only identity, it is positioning in a world where recognition affects contracts, contracts affects cash, and cash affects survival. The ledger writes the ending, and it rarely uses poetry. If you enjoyed this kind of financial history thriller, subscribe to the channel, because the next time you hear a simple historical fact, you'll know to ask one question first. Who controlled the balance sheet? And who was facing insolvency? Optional visual references you can pull while editing or thumbnail planning: a Persian plateau map for geographic mood, a Persepolis relief for imperial scale, and a Reza Shah portrait for the 1935 pivot. Persian plateau map, Persepolis, relief image, Reza Shah image.